So today's lecture is what have we learned in entrepreneurship for the last 40 years?
So one of the interesting questions is, why are you here? And I hope you're here to find out what does it take to go from an idea to a business. And for the last 20 years, if you wanted to know how to go from an idea to a business, the answer from educators and investors was simply, well, go research and then write a business plan and you'll know everything possible to actually start and run your business. We now know that advice was simply wrong. Not kind of wrong, but very wrong. And we now today know something we didn't know before. We now know the right way to build startups. And so this class is about that right way. But before we get started, let's see how we took the wrong path and then see what we now know works. So the modern corporation as we know it was first formed in 1602 with the government-chartered Dutch East India Company. This was kind of the first modern corporation with shareholders and organizations that kind of, if you squinted, looked like something close to modern companies today. By the 1850s in the United States, with railroads spanning the entire country, corporations needed more sophisticated organizations. And in fact, the first org chart was drawn in 1856 to just manage corporations. And by the beginning of the 20th century, educators started realizing that there was a need for an educated management class to administer and execute these corporations. Because at least in the United States, we were going from local economies to regional economies to a national economy, yet we did not have a trained management class. And so in a brilliant insight, Harvard set up the first Masters of Business Administration course called the MBA. And the first graduating class in 1910 was the first of a cadre of business administrators that made the 20th century the modern corporate century. The MBA curriculum was designed to provide managers and administrators with the tools they needed to run existing and growing companies: accounting, strategy, operations, leadership, organizational behavior, human resources, management. And this stack of tools was just incredibly important for the growth of large companies. But what's really interesting, what got missed, is that there were really no tools provided in these curriculums for starting new businesses. One of the things we did not understand for 100 years is that startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Let me say it again. Startups are not smaller versions of large companies. And what falls out of that is all the traditional tools taught and learned in an MBA curriculum are irrelevant in the first chaotic year or two of an early stage venture. Eventually, you need that tool set, but at first, it really gets in the way. Let's take a look at what we used to believe and then contrast it to what we now know. One of the biggest fallacies was believing that startups are just smaller versions of a large company, that everything you do in a large company, you do on day one of a startup. What we now know is something very different. The difference, the core difference, is that startups do something called search, while large companies spend their time, at least their core time, executing. And one of the questions we'll answer is, search for what and execute what? And so later on in this lecture, you'll see the difference. And in fact, will make you a much better entrepreneur. So what we used to believe for strategy is that you start any company with an operating plan and a financial model. What's an operating plan? Well, it's the business plan. And the belief was all I need to do is spend a lot of time writing this plan, and then all I need to do is execute it. And somehow magical thinking said, if I thought hard enough, and if I was smart enough to do all the great market research in the library and looking up all the data, and then put together a forecast, the magic 5-year plan in the back of the business plan, somehow magically, all I needed to do was hire the people to execute that plan. If that doesn't sound silly to you now, don't worry, because it didn't sound silly for 40 years. But we now know that's kind of ridiculous. What we now know is that no business plan survives first contact with customers. The first year or so in a startup is completely unpredictable. What you think you're doing on Monday turns out to be completely wrong on Tuesday. And on Wednesday you discover something new, and on Friday you're almost out of business. But on next Monday you get sold for $1 billion. A startup is an incredible roller coaster, unpredictable series of events that there's no way you could put together in a 5-year plan. Yet somehow investors and educators thought that maybe we could just teach you how to put this all together in a nice spreadsheet. No one ever noticed that the only other people to do 5-year plans were these guys, the Soviet Union. And we kind of know how well that turned out as well. Though, much like the fallacy about business plans and financial forecasts, that lasted for about 80 years. The good news is that we now know that business plans and financial forecasts first are just as silly as it was in the Soviet Union. So, no business plan survives first contact with customers. This doesn't mean we shouldn't have any planning, but it actually means what we need is planning before the plan. And what that really means is you need to figure out how to actually do some planning, and then you get to write the business plan. So let me be clear, I'm not suggesting we never want to do an operating plan, and I'm not suggesting we never want forecasts, but you need some real facts before you could do that. And one of the ways we're going to organize our facts is with Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas. We'll talk about this canvas in some excruciating detail in the following lectures. But you should know we use the canvas for two things. One is, initially, we're going to use it to organize our thinking about all the hypotheses about every part of our business. But second is we're going to get out of the building and actually turn those hypotheses into facts, as we'll find out how to do later. And then, as we turn those hypotheses into facts, we'll be updating the canvas on a regular basis, and it will become a scorecard, a way to keep score for our progress of how much we've learned. So what this means is, instead of writing the operating plan and financial forecast first, we're going to use the business model canvas to actually capture all our hypotheses first. For the search for the business model, we're going to start with the model first, and then after we find the model, we get to write it up. What did we used to believe on how you physically built a startup? What was the process we used? We used to build startups by managing processes. We said, well, hey, we understand how to build products. We build them exactly like we build them in large companies. We hire product managers, and we do something called waterfall engineering, which I'll explain in a second, which basically are step by step by step. In fact, what we used to do is we used to draw this diagram on napkins. We used to say, well, you come up with a concept, then you raise some seed funding, and then you go into product development, and then you have alpha test, beta test, and first customer ship. What could be wrong with that? That's, in fact, for 30, 40 years, this was the canonical model for how to build startups. And we'd say marketing, well, we understand. While engineering is developing the product, marketing is creating all the marketing communications material and, hiring a PR agency and creating early buzz. And then for marketing, the world's most fun job was have the party. You get to create demand by having a launch event, and you think about branding. And your job really was to create end-user demand and drive it into the potential sales channel. For sales, what that meant is, unless the VP of sales was a founder, you tended to hire them around the time engineering was saying, we're in alpha and beta test, and they were going out and starting to hire their first sales staff, and they were looking at your 5-year revenue plan, and since it was obviously came from a burning bush and it was the word of God, they were just going to execute that plan. Why? Because it said so, and you said so, and if you had investors, they said so. There might not be any facts behind it, but there it was. It was the spreadsheet. And so they were building the sales organization. So again, at that first customer ship, if marketing was going to drive demand, they were just going to have a sales curve that took off because the revenue plan said so. The next piece was the biz dev group. And business development used to mean the group that put together all the deals to create the whole product, WHOLE. The whole product meant startups, just because of their size, are incapable of creating all the features and services, etc., that a mainstream customer might need. So why don't we hire business development people to do partnerships so at first customer ship, we could look like a large company for mainstream customers. The only fallacy in this is that you assume that your first customers are going to be in the mainstream. It turns out for most startups, your first customers are actually crazy people like you. And so therefore, creating this entire cloud of deals are actually useful a year after first customer ship, but in fact, just get in your way on day one. The other piece is engineering. And engineering, how simple could that be? It was understood. We did exactly what we did in large corporations. You wrote a market requirements document, then engineering shut their doors, rolled up their sleeves, and went into waterfall engineering, which we'll describe a little later. You hired a QA department, then at the end, finally when it was all done, you hired a tech pubs department, and all the product was ready to go in version 1.0, all the features at one time at first customer ship. And this, for 30 or 40 years, was the way we thought about startups. There can be no other way. This is how we manage the process. We now know this is just simply wrong. And I'll explain to you what we're going to do instead. If you remember, I said engineering was doing waterfall development. Waterfall development is just a step-by-step process that says marketing writes requirements of what the product should do. Engineering takes that and translates that into features. Engineering then designs the product, either codes it or builds the hardware. They test it, and they maintain it. And this is kind of a waterfall life cycle, step by step. But if you really look at this, there's an implicit fallacy that no one ever noticed for 40 years. To write the requirements and do the design assumes on day one you know the problem or need the customer has. Well, let me say it again. Waterfall development assumes you understand the customer problem and need on day one. Now, in a large company with existing customers, existing products, existing sales channel, you know what? This might actually be true. But in most startups, all you have is the founder's vision. And what you tend to do in a startup is confuse a faith-based vision with customer facts about problems and needs. And what happens? The consequence of assuming you know the customer problem means you assume you know every possible feature to ship on day one. So therefore you shut the door and you start implementing. And instead of just implementing a piece at a time, you actually implement every possible feature you could think about for version 1.0. The irony is that we now know somewhere between 85 and 90% of most software product features are unwanted and unneeded by customers. That's an enormous amount of waste of time and money that ends up on the floor. We now know that waterfall and product management execution on two knowns is just kind of the wrong way to approach it in a startup. Makes all the sense in the world in a large company. What we now know is most startups fail from a lack of customers than from a failure of product development. And that's really interesting. Even in Silicon Valley, where we probably take more technical risk per square inch or square foot than anywhere else in the world, we go out of business typically not because we didn't deliver a product. We go out of business because we didn't find enough customers to pay us enough money. That's a big idea. Because if you think about it, we have all these processes to manage the engineering process. Why? Because that is the biggest risk in a large company. But we had no processes to manage the customer risk. In fact, the best we could do is, in the old days, is hire a VP of sales who told you, oh, I have a great Rolodex or a great set of contacts. But we really had no formal process for searching for what customers' needs are. And in fact, we've just come up with one. And that's going to be a key part of this course. This search for the business model, this search for the truth is called customer development. And customer development really has two pieces, the search and its execution. And in this class, we're going to be talking about the first two steps, customer discovery, customer validation, the pivots that connect them. And then if you're so lucky, we actually get to execute your business model in customer creation and company building. The other piece that goes with the process in a startup is not only the customer development process, but an agile engineering process. One example is Extreme Programming, or XP, which basically is built around this idea of iteration and incremental delivery of the product. This is a big idea. It says instead of building every possible feature on day one, we're actually going to incrementally and iteratively interact with customers, test each portion of the product, and see if what we're building actually has a home outside the building. So what this really means is that for process, instead of just going to execution first, hiring product managers, doing waterfall development, or maybe even agile nowadays, we're actually going to start with a customer development process coupled with some kind of agile engineering process. Which one you pick, I use XP as an example, but it could be whatever your favorite process is. And by the way, don't only think that agile engineering, agile development is about software. Toyota and the Toyota production system actually had it for hardware decades before anybody in software ever thought about it. So you could be building products, anything from microprocessors to medical equipment to hardware, software, etc., using an iterative and incremental engineering process. And again, once you're done with that, of course you want to manage this in a formal process, but not before you do the planning. So why do most startups fail? Is it because co-founders fight and the company breaks up? Is it because they can't build their initial spec or vision? Or is it that no one will fund the idea? Or is it that too few people buy or use the product? So why do startups fail? Well, the answer is really all of the above. Co-founders do fight. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of startups never even get to the beginning of the company because the founders just couldn't agree. Two is that sometimes your vision is just too far in advance to actually be built. Or three is it's such an interesting vision or such a bad vision, but it can't attract sufficient capital to get started, and it's maybe too expensive to fund on your own or through your own resources. And the one we'll be actually talking about in some detail during these series of lectures is that you never actually found product market fit. That is, too few people will buy or will use the product. Now, the last interesting thing that's a holdover from thinking about startups as smaller versions of large companies is kind of the hardest to get your head around. And that's large companies, they have VPs of sales. Well, we need a VP of sales on day one. Large companies, they have heads of marketing. I need a head of marketing. And large companies, they have biz dev and all those external organizations. We need those too. Without ever thinking about what's the point? Why is it that we want to duplicate these same organizations? Because if you're a founder like I was, boy, you really want someday to see you on top and look at all these nice silos working for me. Isn't this great? And look, they're all doing their jobs, etc. I have to tell you, if this is your vision on day one, you're already out of business. Because we now know that functional organizations actually are the wrong way to set up sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one. What we now know is that the founders need to run what's called the customer development team. And a customer development team says, listen, we're not going to have sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one. We're not going to hire a VP of sales on day one. We're actually going to have the founder get out of the building. And later in this lecture, we'll explain why. It's a really big idea to understand for organization, you need the founders spending at least 20% of their time outside the building, understanding customers' problems and needs, and figuring out how that matches with the feature set you're building before you start organizing in functional organizations and silos. The other thing I'll mention, which I'll expand on later in this course, is that one of the mistakes that we've also made for decades is confusing the titles, sales, marketing, and biz dev, with the job specifications. It turns out that the title VP of Sales has a very different job spec in a large company than it does in a startup. A VP of Marketing does very different things in a large company than they do in a startup. And for years we could never explain why is it that incredibly competent executives who've been executing business models in large corporations collapse in startups when their company is smaller than their administrative staff in their large corporation. It turns out the job specification, what we do day to day, has nothing similar. So let's just take a look at the last piece, which is why you're here. How do we teach entrepreneurship? Well, in the past, entrepreneurial education was about execution. We're going to teach you how to write a business plan. We're going to teach you how to put together the PowerPoint for the VC presentation, where if we're doing it really well, we'll have you do lots of research. But it really assumed it was all about execution. What we now know, that's just simply not the case. Entrepreneurial education, the reason why you're taking this class, is about the search for the business model. And we're going to teach you how to search. And so for that, what that means about entrepreneurial education is that eventually we do need you to know everything an MBA knows. Eventually, if you're successful in growing your startup into a large company, you're going to need to know about accounting and HR and organizational behavior and global leadership and etc. But at first, you need a different set of skills that just never existed before. And so welcome to the first class of its type that's going to put search first. And that's a radical change. It's not just one more methodology. So this class is going to teach you all the skills about strategy and process and organization. And eventually, if you build a successful company, will then allow you to write the plans and operating documents and financial spreadsheets to actually execute the company. So hold on to your seats. We're about to get started, and let's jump into business models and customer development. What can happen to a startup? Take a look at the list below and check all that apply. So what can happen to a startup? Well, the best thing that can happen to a startup is that it can grow into a company, and hopefully a large company, after you've found a repeatable and scalable business model. Or two is, you could still be pivoting and iterating as you continue to search for a business model. Or three is, you could have found a business model, but maybe one that isn't an explosive growth, but you could be growing slowly and barely breaking even. Or four is, maybe you never found a business model that can make money, and you ran out of money and time, and you shut your company down. So the answer is all of the above.